Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So, I've been talking about Webflow for a while, but I just want to tell you my own story with the tool. When I was younger, when I was a freelancer, I used to write HTML and CSS manually. And I'd been doing that for many years. And over time, I graduated to frameworks like things like Bootstrap. And, after working with several clients, I realized one thing, right? You can call yourself a web designer and you can put in 10 or 20 hours of effort per project, or you can put in 100 hours of effort per project. But at the end of the day, you're not paid per line of code. That's not how this works. You are paid for producing something that looks and works wonderfully well, right? That gives the user a good experience. Now, if there are tools that allow you to do that faster, then why not go with it, right? And before I used Webflow, I used to think, you know what? I'm a coder. Like, I can actually write code. Why do I need tools like this? And it was my arrogance that prevented me from using a tool that made me faster. But, then when I started a company and I went through the entire grind, I hadn't written HTML or CSS in a long time. That's when I rediscovered Webflow. And I told myself, I had become different. My criteria had gone from making money when I was a freelancer to speed as an entrepreneur, right? Because all that matters when you're an entrepreneur is, can you be faster than the next person? And with that new quest for speed came the humility to be able to use the tools that make my life better and make my work faster, regardless of what that makes me feel like. So in this episode, I'm going to show you an awesome tool called Webflow. It's basically a visual way to do exactly what we've been doing so far. So writing both HTML as well as CSS in a visual way. Now, whatever you do on Webflow, at the end of the day, it gets converted into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. So in this episode, we're going to start or look at the basics of Webflow and get a hang of the interface so that we can start doing cool stuff from the next one. All right, let's get started. Okay, so webflow.com is where we need to head, and you can create an account for free. I've already created an account. I think you're allowed to have 2 websites out there for free with a free account, so you guys can have one of that. So I'm just gonna get in and I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to create a blank canvas. Let's just call it Meta Platform, right? So I'm just going to create a simple website for you guys to understand how Webflow works. Takes a while to load, but I quickly want to introduce you guys to the interface. So on the left here is the navigator. It's like a tree, right? And all the HTML boxes that we have one inside the other, we can see it here. We can see all the different elements and components here on the left, right? Here on the left is your add component or add element button. So you can see all the elements. You can see the columns and the div blocks and the link blocks and the buttons, and you can add a video and an image. It doesn't matter, right? You can add many different types of components. We're going to come to that later. Then there's the idea of navigator. The navigator is what we had opened, and you can also hide it in case you want more screen space. Then there's the pages tool, right? So the pages function, I can actually click on the settings here. I can add a title. Remember, we added a title before manually. You can actually add a title. I can say a new website, and the meta description, I can say a website about cats and dogs, right? And I can just have open graph, which is Facebook's, the way Facebook takes your title and description, just like Google, you can just make it, copy it, right? So I've just set this up quickly, and you can keep adding more pages, right? You can just duplicate a page, or you can just add a new page from here. We're not going to do any of that. I'm just saving that. The rest of the features like the CMS, the e-commerce tool, and the assets, we're not going to look at right now. It's not very important. But maybe, as this course keeps going on, I think we'll do 1 or 2 episodes a month. I'm going to talk about how to use the CMS and the store functionality of Webflow. All right, so let's get started. We have on the left the navigator with the body. So we can assume that the head tag as well as the body tag as well as the outer HTML tag are already created, and that's okay. On the right, we see the style, right? And this is the CSS. And we can see all the CSS of the body, everything from the margin to the padding to the width and the height, to the text and the typography. So I'm just going to close all of these. So you see what are the different categories of styles available. So you have layout, spacing, size, position, typography, which is text, backgrounds, borders, and effects. These are the basic styles, right? And everything that we've been using so far in CSS, like for example, your font size property or your background image URL, all of that is categorized very neatly in Webflow, so you don't have to remember any rules. That's why I don't remember the rules these days, because I just use Webflow to do all of these, and it's been years since I've written manual HTML and CSS code, right? Then there's the settings. So every HTML element has settings. So if I inserted a link, I'd need some settings for the link, right? Where does the link go to? And that's in these settings, right? And as we create more stuff, we'll go through the settings. Then there's the style manager, which we're not going to be looking at. I don't use it. And then there's the interaction manager, which is JavaScript, which I don't think we should look at right now, because we don't want to have those funky bounces and things like that. That's not very important right now. So let's get a web page up and rolling. First, what we're going to do is we're going to create a nice little navigation bar. So I'm going to go here, add element, and I'm going to click on a nav bar, right? And that's it. Webflow has automatically created a nav bar, and let's look at what's in this nav bar, right? Let's open this. We can see there's a container, and containers are basically divs that have a certain margin on the left and right preset. So a container is like something that's centered with margin on the left and right. And this is a Webflow specific thing. It's also available in Bootstrap, but it's basically a way to keep everything centered on the viewport instead of having the user look all the way to the left or the right. So container just snaps things in a good way in the center, right? So the container, let's open that. We have something on the left. I think this is floated to the left, and it's called a brand. And I'm sure let's just open all of this out. Right, let's just open all of this out. Okay, and as you can see with float, you can see that this has been floated to the left, right? So you can see floats, and it's floated to the left, and you can see that this part, which is the nav menu, is floated to the right as expected. So floating here is just one click, and clearing is also, a bunch of small clicks, right? So it's very easy to do. So let's start with this, right? So inside the brand, let's put an image into this brand. Say image, choose. Let's get a really small image. I hope I have something small. Let's see. Do you have something small, Varun? Well, let's use this Instagram outline. It's a very small image. Let's make it 50 pixels. Really tiny picture of this. And what we're going to do with this image is let's add a little bit of margin to this image. So we'll add a margin to it to a certain extent. And this is CSS, right? What you didn't notice, and what I noticed, is suddenly a selector for a class came in here, and it's called image. It just automatically created itself, right? So this image is here, and that's great. We have home, we have about, and we have contact. And as you can see, when we hover over any of these, nothing's really happening. So I want to give it a nice hover effect like we did in the past. So we're going to click on this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call it navigation underscore item, right? I've just created a random class, called it navigation item. I'm going to call this also navigation underscore item. I'm going to give the third thing also a class, navigation underscore item. So with this class selected, right? With this class selected, I'm going to go and I'm going to apply, I'm actually going to change its state. So I'm going to click on the drop down, and I can click on a state. I'm going to see the hover state. And on the hover state, I'm going to change the color to red, right? So now I'm going to go back to the normal state. And as you can see, the hover not only makes this red, but also everything else with the navigation item class, which is awesome. Now, if I want something specifically to not have the hover, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the navigation item class. And as you can see now, a hover on contact doesn't change the color to red. So this is the beautiful part about Webflow. When you give something a class here, and then you change its properties here, it applies to all the other entities on the page with the same class. Now, the navigation is something we're going to be using very often, right? And it's something that we should probably make it reusable across our different pages, because different pages still have the same navigation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this. I'm going to click on symbols. In Webflow, symbols allow you to reuse content in a design, right? So we're going to actually create a symbol. Right click on the element and click on create symbol. Now this has become a symbol. I'm just going to call it the navigation, right? And that's been created, and that's it. You can always double click the symbol and edit it, but at the end of the day, you can reuse this symbol across any of your pages, right? So I'm just going to go to one of the other pages. I'm just going to create a new page. Create new page. I'm going to call this cats. Yeah, I'm just going to call it cats. This page is for cats, right? I'm going to create this page. And as you can see, this is a blank page, but I can go in here. I can click on symbols. I have one navigation here. I'm just going to drag it in and voila. You don't have to do any extra effort. There's no copy pasting code. There's no meddling with any settings. It's automatically created. So let me go back to my previous page now. I'm going to go back to home, right? And as you can see, we have this nice little home page with our hovered buttons. And now what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start creating different divs. Maybe I'm going to have a big header image here. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Google and find a header image. And I use a platform, if you've been following the design content, I use Unsplash. You get some free high resolution images. I'm just going to say, well, cats and dogs. Let's see. Let's have this. Actually, this is not, we need something horizontal. Let's just find cats. That's okay. We'll make this website about cats. So we have this. I'm going to right click, save image as. It's going to get saved here. And I am going to create, using the add elements, I'm going to create a new section. Now, what section does? Section is just a way to clump up a lot of divs and a lot of components. A good way to mentally kind of space things out. So I've created a section here. It's just like a big thing that goes from one end to the other end. It doesn't have any height, but it looks like there's a height here. The truth is there's zero height. It's just Webflow's way of showing you that you can edit this, because if this was zero height, you wouldn't be able to select it. So it's showing you that it has some height, but it doesn't actually have a height. So let's see. Okay, so let's see. Inside the section, I'm going to create a div block, right? So as you can see, a div block has been created. We know what divs are. That's exactly what a div block is. And inside this div block, I am going to give this a new background. I'm going to click on new background. I'm going to choose an image, right? I'm going to upload one. Let's see. Let's go to the desktop. Actually, wait. We can just drag and drop this, I think. Well, for some reason, yeah, okay, sorry. All right, so I've downloaded this image. I think you can't right click and save. You have to click on download free. I'm just going to drag and drop this. And an image is here, which I'm going to use for the div block. So as you can see, a line of cats has been created here. So we have to do some modification before we can use this. The first thing is we're going to give this some height, right? Because without a height, we know the height is 0. This is just for visual purposes. But let's give it a height of 500 pixels, right? And sure enough, we have this stretch out to 500 pixels. Now there's a real height. With the width, I'm going to give it a width of 100%. That's just going to absorb the entire width of the page. And you can give width in pixels, you can give height in pixels, or you can give it in percentages or EM. And I'm not going to teach you what EM is here, but we're going to use percentages here because we don't know what the browser viewport width is going to be depending on the screen. So we've created this width, or we've created this nice little cat image here. I'm going to go to your background, right? I'm going to open it and I'm going to click on this and I'm going to make some changes to the background. And as you can see, all the properties from the image to the size to the position to the tiling, all of it is available visually. So I'm just going to say cover, right? and I'm going to center the image. I'm just going to click on the center spot. And as you can see, the cat image has been centered. And this is the beautiful part about, Webflow, which is all of this happened visually. So I'm just going to increase the height a little bit, actually. I'm just going to make it 700 pixels. And you can see a little more of the cat. It's a very cute cat. I'm just going to change the navigation bar a little bit. I'm going to make this navigation bar completely white in color. So I'm going to go to the background color and I am going to make this white. Yep, so that looks a little better. Now, we have this cat image here. Inside this, on one side, I want a small form. And on the other side, I want some text about how cats are awesome or something like that. Although cats are not really awesome. Cats are terrible. So I'm going to go to components and I'm going to use something called columns. Now I want you to understand something, right? The viewport can be large, right? It can be large, it can be small, depending on which screen you're looking at it from. With Bootstrap, the idea of a grid was created. The grid theory basically said, let's split up the entire page into 12 different columns. 12 exact different columns. And you can't see it, but it's equally divided. And whether you're on a big screen or a large screen, if every box can be divided into 12 columns, then we can work with it more easier because we can use percentages to position something rather than direct pixels. So columns, and I'm just going to create columns, right? And as you can see, you can choose any different type of column style. And you can see it here. There's a gap between these two. We can have 2 columns. We can have 3 columns. We can have as many columns as we want. And on the left side, there are 6 columns. On the right side, on the left side, the spacing is 6. On the right side, the spacing is 6. What does that add up to? 12. So this entire thing has a set of 12 grids or columns, and we've split it down so that this takes up 6 spaces and this takes up 6 spaces, and we have 2 columns in total, right? If I wanted 3, I can do 3. If I wanted 4, I can do 4. It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to use 2 for now. And the column, I assume, is inside the div block. That's awesome. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this column a margin, right? And when I give the column a margin, as you can see, even the div block moves, right? So I'm going to undo, that's Control Z. And instead, I'm going to go to the div block and give the div block a padding. And that will move the column down. Because remember, in CSS, all of these are blocks. Blocks move everything together unless you use some sort of position relative, which we don't want to use right now. So instead, we'll use padding on the parent entity and we'll move the columns down a little bit till here. Right? So now what I want to do in the columns is in the left column, I want to add some text. So let me add a paragraph, right? And there's some paragraph, you can't read it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the size of the typography on the text to maybe 50 pixels, right? I'm going to give it a text height of 50 pixels so that the text, the distance between each line is a little higher, right? So we have this here and I'm going to give it a white color. Okay, now it's starting to look really ugly, but this is the idea with Webflow. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an effect on the background cat. So I'm going to click back on the div block with the cat inside it. And I am going to add an effect. Actually, I'm not going to add an effect. I'm going to add a new gradient on it, right? And I'm going to make this gradient between black to maybe dark gray. Right? And this is how you use a gradient. And as you can see, there's a gradient and then there's the content below. Actually, I'm not going to use a gradient. I'm going to delete the gradient. I'm going to just add a simple, solid color, just a color overlay. I'm going to give the color overlay a color of maybe red, but I'm going to change the opacity such that the cat is barely visible. Right? So you can have, as you can see here, you can have some overlay and then below that you can have an image. The order matters a lot, so make sure you put the image first and then the color or gradient overlay later. Right? And this is a cool part about Webflow. You don't need Photoshop for all this. You don't need to think about the code. You don't need to Google any references. You get it all instantly. So I'm going to go to the paragraph. Actually, I'm going to go to the columns itself, the main columns, and I'm going to give it some padding. I'm going to say padding left, let's say 10 pixels, and padding right, 10 pixels. Just, a little bit of space so it doesn't stick to the left. So I'm going to click back on this text and I'm going to change the font to Montserrat. I'm going to make it a little smaller actually. 40. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a special effect to the text, and that effect, actually we can add it from here. We can add a text. Let me just close everything so that it doesn't confuse you. So the effects for text are in the typography panel itself, which is text shadows. And I'm going to add a shadow. I'm going to blur it out. I'm going to give it some distance so it's a little lower. Right? And instead of black, I'm going to just reduce the opacity of this so it's not very jarring. Right? So we have some text on the left. This is some random sample text. I'm going to change that. I'm going to say, why not adopt a cat today? They are absolutely evil and do not want to miss out on the horror of having one in your house. Right? Just some random stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on column 1. I'm going to add an element and I'm going to add a heading. Right? And I'm going to pull this heading, and you can just do this drag and drop in WebFlow. I'm going to put it on top of the cat, and in the heading, I'm going to say, a cat could be yours today. Right? And I'm going to click on the heading. I'm going to make it much larger. We want our headings to be larger, maybe 60 pixels with a height of maybe 60 pixels. And this is text height. What we're using, it's called line height in CSS. It's just a way to make sure there's some space around the text. So I just put line height. A cat could be yours today. Let's give this also a drop shadow, or text shadow, but very, very, very subtle. Okay, awesome. Cool. So this paragraph, I'm going to give it a top margin, a little bit of a top margin. So it's pushed out from this. And what I'm going to do with the text is I'm going to make sure all the text is aligned to the right. This is different from floating. We're actually aligning the text to the right, just like in Microsoft Word or any other tool. So right align this, click on this, right align this, and it's just a good design style. If you have 2 columns and you have text on one of them, make sure the text sticks to the other side. So as you can see here, it's on the right side. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form. Now, how that's going to happen is I'm going to click on add element, and I'm not going to add a form. I'm going to add a button, right? No, I'll add a form. I'll add a form. And I can just click on form block, and an entire block is added. I'm going to make this a form that we're not going to use, but it's just something I want to show you guys. So we have this form block. I'm going to close that for now. What I'm going to do to the form block is I'm going to say, I only want this form block to be 50% of the width of its parent, right? So you have the column. The form block, I want it to be just 50% of the width of the parent. Actually, let's make that 75% of the width of the parent. And I want its margin to be 0 auto. Now, we've done 0 auto in the past, so I'm going to teach you 0 auto again, right? In WebFlow, 0 auto is as simple as just clicking this button here, which will center the element horizontally as long as the display style is block. And this form block is a block, so the display we don't have a problem with the display. We've just basically centered it horizontally by using this thing here, right? You also need a fixed width to center something horizontally, which is why I gave it 75%. Now let's do some magic with this, right? Let's add some padding. Let's add 20 pixels of padding on all sides. 20 pixels here. So just added 20 pixels of padding. Let me give this a background. Let me give it a color. Give it a background color of maybe black. And as you can see, you can add a color, or you can also give it a color overlay. Here we're adding a color instead of giving a color overlay. All right. Okay. This seems fine. Now, one cool thing we can do with the border, and I'm just going to open the border, is I can actually give this a radius. Right. So I'm going to say, a little bit of radius, and as you can see, the border radius is kicking in. Looks good. Now, the field label, and as you can see, there are many different field labels. I'm going to give the field label a class because I'm going to edit this. I don't like the color. So I'm going to say label _ white. I'm just going to give it a class. The other field label, I'm going to also call this label _ white. and I'm going to change the typography, and I'm going to change the color to white. Right? I'm going to change it from Arial to maybe XO, and I'm going to change the size to 25, maybe change the height also to 25. Right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little more of a margin, and it'll apply not just to this one, but also the other field label with the label underscore white class, just to make things good. Right. So now I'm going to take the submit button. I don't like it as it is right now. I'm going to change the color to black, right? Just to align with our theme that we're going with here. By the way, this is a horrible website, right? It's not a very well-designed website, but it's something I'm teaching you just to get used to Webflow. As we do more and more websites, we are going to get better and better with the design. We're going to do some complex stuff. So I'm clicking on the submit button and change the size of the text to maybe 25. We'll change the height also to 25, the line height. And what I'm going to do here, as you can see, is this text is inline block. This display, which I've told you about before, is inline block, which is why it's not going all the way to the ending. Here, I actually want this text to be all the way to the ending. So I'm going to switch it back to block, and I am going to increase the width to 100%, which will basically make sure it looks like a nice big submit button. I'm going to increase the padding a little bit, just maybe 20 on both the top and the bottom. And we have a nice little submit button. And maybe increase the margin a little bit to distance it from the top. Awesome. So we have a submit button, we have a name, we have an email address. We're not actually going to make this form functional. It's actually very easy to do it in Webflow, which is you just go to element settings and you can say, where should the form go? Right? What should it look like on success? What should it look like on error? Everything, right? So you can do all of these cool stuff, but we're not actually going to create any backend content using Webflow. I would not recommend it. Maybe in the ending, we'll do a simple form, but I still prefer you guys use a third-party form creation tool rather than use Webflow, because I don't think Webflow is there when it comes to forms and when it comes to storing data in general. So let's go back to style. And as you can see, we have this section, we have all this cool stuff. Now what I'm going to do is I want to show some cat pictures, right? And instead of us using columns like we have here, so we have two columns here, one column on the left and one column on the right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new section. I'm going to close this entire section. We're done with that. I'm going to click on body. And whenever you create a new element in Webflow, it always comes below whatever element is selected. It comes as a child of whatever element is selected. So I'm selecting body and I am going to add an element and I'm going to say another section. I want another section. So I have a section here, and inside the section, I'm going to use something called a grid. So I'm going to add elements. I'm going to click on grid. Right now, grid it's awesome, right? It avoids the headache of us having to do floats. Now, this is something very new in CSS. The actual CSS grid is different from the 12-column grid that I told you. This is a specific grid that you can use. And FR is the unit of the grid, and you don't have to worry about what that means. So here, you can have columns and you can have rows. So usually I pick the direction as rows, and the gap is basically the gap between this gap that you see here, this, between all the elements. So I'm going to increase the gap a little bit. I'm going to say 30 again. Okay. And I'm going to add maybe another column. So we'll have 9 pictures in total. That should be good enough. And yeah, I think this is good. So I'm just going to select this. And as you can see the outline of the grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just exit the grid, and you can do that by clicking somewhere here. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to implement something inside the grid. I'm going to put up a picture inside the grid. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to figure out another picture of a cat. I'm just going to download this. Thank you, Eric, Jan, Lusink. Crediting isn't required, but it's appreciated, and it allows photographers to gain exposure. Well, you just gained some exposure, mate. Inside the grid, I'm going to add an element, and I'm going to click on image. Right? And I'm going to choose this image, and I'm going to take Eric's image of this cat in here. Well, sometimes the drag and drop doesn't work. So I'm just going to see where this is at right now. Okay. So yeah, the drag and drop stopped working. Again, Webflow is not a perfect tool yet. They're still building things out, but it works reasonably well. I'm going to change the width, and I'm going to say, Well, 250 pixels. That's all we need this to be. It's not going to change much because the grid keeps everything in a particular size. And as you can see here, actually, I'm going to just unlock the size. It's not going to go to all its 2000 pixels. It's just going to stay this big. Now, what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to click on this. I'm going to drag this until here. And it's an interesting thing you can do with the grid is you can actually make sure the grid, one element takes up the space of 2 or one element takes up the space of 3 while maintaining aspect ratio. So you can do all of this, and as you can see, you still have 3 columns here. So I'm going to undo both, Control Z, and just to maintain sanity. But you can do some cool stuff with the grid. Now, there's a reason the bottom of the grid is sticking to the bottom, and that's because on this section, there's no real padding on the top or bottom. Now, if I change anything in this section, it's also going to affect this section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call it section gallery. Right? I'm just going to save that. Now it's not going to affect anything else. I'm going to give ourselves a nice little padding of 40 pixels on all sides. 40 pixels on all sides. And now if you click on the grid, you can see that it's a little separated from everything around it. So I'm going to continue to add some elements into the grid. Actually, I'm just going to copy the same element. That's Control C and Control V, Control V, Control V, Control V, Control V. We have 6 pictures of the same goddamn cat from Eric. And now I can show you some interesting stuff, right? So I can take this cat, I can, increase it to 2 spaces. This is some awesome stuff, funky stuff that you can do with the grid. You can move it around. It keeps the aspect ratio. It keeps things interesting. You can do stuff like this. You can actually just make this absorb all 4. And as you can see, the ratio is maintained. I can delete, these 2, and it'll still maintain, the aspect ratios as well as the numbers. It's a nice way to do gallery. Think about it in a smart way, and you can align it in many different ways. So you can actually do some good stuff with this. This is all trial and error and experimentation, in my opinion. So you can do a lot of interesting stuff with the alignment here. It's useful, especially when you have responsive view, and I'll show you what that means. And you can distribute this in many ways. So right now, all the content is stretched. I can have all the content work in many different ways, and you can't see any of the results. You can't see any of the results right now because this kind of perfectly fits in, but otherwise you can. All right, so we have the grid, and I'm going to create one last section now. I'm going to go back to the body, create a new section, last section, and I'm going to call this the footer. Right now, what I'm going to do with this section is I'm actually going to give this a height of 300 pixels, and I'm going to give it a width of 100%, and I'm going to change the background color to dark gray. Yeah, looks like a good color, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some copyright information for anybody who's interested. So I'm just going to click on plus. I'm going to click on maybe a paragraph. Actually, I'll add some columns here, right? I'm going to add 3 columns, okay? And I'm just going to open this. I'm going to create a new class for the columns, otherwise it's going to affect the previous columns. Let's just call it footer underscore columns, right? I'm going to give it a top margin of a little bit. Actually, no, we're not going to do that. We've learned from this mistake. So we click on footer, we give it a padding from the top. Okay. And in this column 1, I'm going to add a paragraph of text. I'm going to make that text white. Just some random shit. In column 2, I'm going to add maybe a list of items, maybe an unordered list of items without bullets. I'm just going to write some text here. You know what? Each of these lists can have a block quote. Wait. Okay, I'm just going to write some stuff inside. Hello 1, hello 2, hello 3. Right? You can't see it. It's really small, which is why I'm not even going to edit the list item. I'm going to edit the list itself. I'm going to increase its typography and increase that to 30 pixels, height to 30 pixels to the line height. I'll change the color to white. And if I want margins between these list items, then again, we go and create classes list item. I'm just going to call that whatever, list underscore item. We repeat the class. We're naming the class list underscore item. All right, now you pick any of the list items, give it a margin. Actually, we'll give it a bottom margin. And bingo, it applies to all three. And finally, I think here we can just add another image, which is going to put the same cat in, same exact cat in, and we'll give it a width of maybe 300 pixels. Yep, should be good enough. And in each of these containers, in each of these three columns, I'm actually going to center this. And the reason it didn't center right now is because it doesn't have a width. Here, I'm going to give it 100%. Actually, I'm going to give it a 50% width. Center that, change it to block, and ta-da! Same thing with the list. List is already a block. I'm going to give it a width of maybe 50% and have that centered too. And this can stay where it is. All right, so this looks like a terrible footer, but you probably got the point. We've made a simple website with all of this. Now, one question you're probably asking is, Varun, is this responsive? How is this going to look on a mobile phone or a tablet? Because we know that people look at websites from every different way, right? On many different devices. So in WebFlow, you can see what it'll look like on other devices using these, right? So I'm going to click on tablet. And as you can see, everything is perfectly suited to tablet. There are no big issues that we have to handle. You can click on the mobile landscape and you can see there are some issues now. There's some tiny issues now. The gallery has disappeared. And finally, you can click on the mobile portrait and you can see that a lot of things are breaking. So we are actually going to go out and now fix this. So let's click on tablet and I'm going to actually add some padding at the bottom. Right? So this gives it some space. I'm going to take the form block, maybe give it a little more padding from the top and the bottom. Right? Now, when you edit something in WebFlow, all the edits apply to all the sizes smaller than it. So I made some edits now, and those sizes are applied to everything smaller than this particular size. And as you can see, those numbers are shown in anything that's edited is shown in orange, right? So here you can see everything's in blue, but now here when you're making responsive edits, it's shown in orange. So you have this menu bar that's changed, and this is automatic and default through the navigation thing that we used, the navigation component that we used. And we can, when we visit or publish this website, we can see what that looks like. This thing looks fine. I think there's no problems with this grid. Yep, this grid doesn't seem to have problems. And this looks fine too. So this is okay. But whatever change we made here has now been added to the mobile landscape as well as the mobile portrait. So let's actually go to the mobile landscape and see what the problem is. Now that we've fixed the padding here, this should not be an issue any longer. But this text, we don't want it aligning to the right. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this, and I'm just going to, center align the text. I'm going to center align this text too. And as you can see, this doesn't affect anything above it. This is all still right aligned, but here we've center aligned the text. In fact, I'm just going to add a little bit of a margin at the bottom too. This is not going to affect any size bigger than it, but it is going to affect sizes smaller than it. Right? This thing looks fine. This is breaking. So I'm going to change this from height, which is a mistake, to minimum height. Right? I'm going to change this height back to its auto property. Right? And as you can see, this looks fine. In fact, I'm going to give this image a little bit of a bottom margin. It's not going to have a bottom margin in any of the larger sizes. It's only going to have a bottom margin in the smaller sizes. And I'm going to take all the list items and I'm going to align them to the center because we want that to happen in a responsive view. And as you can see, we've just quickly fixed up the responsive view. Now, finally, I'm going to go to mobile portrait. Everything here looks fine too. Maybe what we can do with the grid is, I can edit the grid actually. And I can change the gap from 30 to, I'm just going to change the gap. No, I'm not going to make it 0, but maybe I'm going to make it 5 and 5. I'm reducing the distance between the grid, and I'm going to edit the grid. I'm going to change and remove some areas so that it's a little different here than in the top. And as you can see, this still has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements, but this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements, but in a different way. There's some extra space. So as you can see, I changed the order of the grid here, and it's a lot of playing around with. You can actually even have individual elements that you can edit. In fact, I can just take this and make this a double. I mean, I can have 2 of this, but that's not going to change anything above. That's the beautiful part about grid, right? You can make everything look different on different browsers. It's really cool. I can delete stuff, right? And that's not going to change, right? So that's about it. This is the idea behind responsive design to just continue making edits. I'm going to take this and center align it just so it looks good. And that's how you make responsive websites. Cool. So this was a long tutorial where we went through almost everything. From the next episode, we're going to start taking on slightly more and more complicated problems. Plus, we're going to focus on the design. We're going to start making good designs. We're going to start making things that actually look good. We're going to use real images. And we're going to see if we can replicate some popular websites out in the world there. I'm going to be taking some very popular websites that all of us know and try to recreate it using WebFlow. And once you see 2 or 3 websites being created, once you follow me on those 2 or 3 websites, you should be able to create absolutely any front end or any visual website that doesn't have too much interaction. Right? And then when you work with a developer tomorrow, you'll be able to make any app you want and make it look damn good while you're at it. All right, so that's it for this episode. Catch you on the next.